this is one of the reasons why I'm not sure drift is actually a useful way to describe even what we're talking about. Because what he just described is actually adjustments, right? I adjusted my performance based upon what I knew and what information I had given to me, right? And I think when we frame it in that way and understand that people are not drifting, they are acting in a way that makes sense to them in the moment. They are intentional actors. They are real people, right? Then we will start to see, okay, maybe we need to treat this differently. To get to Brian's question, which was very smart, okay, I want to make a really important point here using the black line, blue line model. And the idea is that drift is different than variability. I don't think these are necessarily the same. I think variability can include drift, right? But not all variability is drift. So typically we'll see a black line, oh my goodness, that went really fast. We'll see a black line and a blue line like this, right? I don't believe that's drift. I believe that's just normal performance variability. Because every time someone does work, they're not, let's be honest, it is extraordinarily rare that someone follows a procedure, rule, or even a norm prescriptively, blindly, without thought. It is very rare. Maybe we do that when we build IKEA furniture. That's probably it. Okay. Outside of that, we zig and we zag based on what makes sense to us, right? Now, that isn't to say that the procedure, though, is useless, and then I'll get to your question. I'll get to that one second. It's not to say the procedure is useless. It's just to say that the procedure isn't the only thing guiding action. But notice that the procedure is guiding action. Right? So sometimes people will frame like, oh, we just need work is done, not work is imagined. But that's actually not necessarily true, right? Because we don't want to remake how we do work every single day. Work is imagined sort of creates the gravity around which work migrates. It's a way to think about it. Yeah?
Just do it. Solely drifting.
Solely drifting?
Solely.
Like Sully Sullenberger? Yeah, I think that's an excellent example, right? So now it's hard. One of the Sully definitely had to drift or deviate, right? Maybe we'll say from some standard or expectation. Now, using my definition, it's hard to say because maybe would he do it every time? We're not going to test. Okay, how many times when you lose all engines will you do this? But I think you're right. That's an example. It's the same processes that we'd point to when we say drift. I think you're right. Well, yes, he did literally drift. Yes, he did. This is accurate. I can't lie. I can't argue with that. So the other way to look at it, so we have our work as imagined, and sometimes we'll see a blue line that's like this, right? Where we see a clear and persistent migration away from the black line. Right? In this particular case, I think this is drift. And importantly, I think when we observe this, we will often see, again, not random variation, but we will actually, if we can start to infer that there is a new black line that has emerged, a new way that work has done. That first black line could be what we call, or what Steve Schirach calls, work as prescribed, right? Which is not necessarily the same as work as imagined. There are many, many times that people will have at different parts of the organization an imagination or a perception of how this work is done. I remember I was doing an investigation after an accident involving some rail car loaders who were loading acid, and I was talking about it with the plant manager, and we were saying, okay, what's the procedure for this? And he would outline the procedure for me, and then I'd say, okay, where is the procedure? And he would have no idea. And when we finally found it, even what he told me wasn't the same that was in the procedure. Okay, that's just stuff that happens. I'm not going to throw him under the bus or anything. I'm just going to say that's something that happens. And I think there's many times that we would start to see that, hey, work as imagined is actually shifting over time. I think that is the essence of drift, if drift is a thing. If drift is a thing, it is a shift in work as imagined within a cohesive work group. And if that's the case, number one, I think drift is not a problem we need to eliminate. It's an indicator to be monitored. There's one interesting paper where the person said drift is actually an indication not of what the individuals are doing, but what the organization is doing relative to its environment. Right? So the blue line, we were talking about this over lunch, the blue line shows the zigging and the zagging, which is good and interesting, but what it's hiding is what is the zigging and zagging for. It's not random, it's happening for a reason. So maybe we can monitor where drift is occurring, and that can be an indicator that, hey, the conditions in this environment are different than the ones that we expected, or even in the ones in other parts of the organization. There's something different that's there that we should be understanding and monitoring. So the question is, how often should you be looking for this stuff? But this is why, number one, the word monitor is important, not measure. We're not necessarily going to measure it. We're going to monitor it over time. So we're going to look at the work that's happening today, and then just see where it's trending towards, where it's moving away from, moving towards, et cetera, right? Put that work in context. Give it historical context. And then, if you know something about the future, you can quit your job and move to Vegas. But otherwise, you could maybe put in context there. But in terms of the amount of time, I would imagine that, and I'm totally thinking out loud right now, I don't have a firm prescription on that. I would say that probably would depend a lot on the level of pressure and complexity, because one of the other things that drives this variation that then ultimately becomes adjustments that turn into drift is pressure, it's scarcity, it's basically the elements of complexity that we point to. So the more complex, including the more work pressure you face, it moved away, the more often you should be looking. Secondly, if we increase the ability to learn about everyday work, that can illuminate and inform drift, right? And I think this probably is a horse that's been beaten to death over this conference, but I'm going to hit it one more time. It's critical, right? Because the third piece, managing the flow of information, I believe, is one of our core functions, especially if we're thinking about managing this thing we want to call drift. Most of the cases that I can think of where drift has led to a failure have one of the contributing factors is information that was held in one part of the organization that was really important to making good decisions didn't make it to where it needed to go. The information was siloed, it was presented in a way where it was hard to make sense of it, something like that. And so if we are worried about drift, it's not that drift is occurring, it's where is it occurring, and what does that mean about the flow of information? What do those people know that we don't know? And what do we know that they don't know? And what about our information movement and learning systems is inhibiting that? Why don't we already know? You know what I mean? That's the kind of stuff I think we should be thinking about.